We are joined by very special guest, the former Secretary of State and Senior Counsel for Global Affairs at the ACLJ, Mike Pompeo. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you, Logan.
We got to start here. And look, we're going to talk about China. We're going to get there. But we're coming off a couple segments specifically about the border crisis or the lack of crisis or the word crisis, the over-politicization of that word. And I have a question for you. We've seen poll numbers plummet specifically on what's going on with immigration. However, they won't call it a crisis, and I feel like we've politicized a word, and they've politicized a word for maybe absolutely no reason, and it kind of is a distraction, if you will, for really what's going on. But what do you think they're trying to accomplish here by denying the reality that we can all see very clearly?
It's a good question. I can't figure out the word game either. Call it crisis, call it catastrophe, call it a disaster, call it whatever one may. What we know is there's a real risk to American security if we don't have sovereignty at our southern border. They've given that up by allowing these people to travel into our country who aren't here lawfully and then releasing them inside of the country. It's a humanitarian calamity as well. I won't use the word crisis. Humanitarian calamity. Young kids, women being trafficked across our border and the coyotes and cartels preying on them. These are things that are bad. I don't know why they've shied away from using that word. I'm happy to use whatever word they'd like. What I'd really like to see are actions that will protect American sovereignty and stop this trafficking across our border.
That's what's important. And that's what I was trying to get to our audience is even as conservative news, you'll see them focusing on, he used a word, didn't use a word. That's one of the more ridiculous talking points I've ever seen, because this should not be the conversation. This show should not be about the fact that Joe Biden, President Biden, said the word crisis and then they walked it back. What should be the content is the actual issue at hand, which is all the things you just laid out. And speaking of other issues, yesterday we spent a lot of time, the whole show, on what was going on with China and the dealings John Kerry had with China, essentially creating a agreement, if you will, for climate change and for to fix those sort of issues. While we're dealing with what you famously said, making this a genocide of what's happening in China. Why do you think that this operates in a vacuum to where we have a genocide that's happening? We have China who has major human rights and other violations. On the other hand, though, where they're signing these agreements for climate change.
It's a real head scratcher to see how they have subverted all the important things that really matter to America to a Secretary Kerry climate change first policy. It's really weird, right? Because they know too it's genocide. Secretary Blinken said so as well. We know what's happening here in the United States. We know they've tried to steal our intellectual property. They've taken millions of jobs. We know they released the Wuhan virus on the world and covered it up. And yet somehow I think the Chinese Communist Party has convinced the administration if we promise you something on climate, if we pretend that we're going to reduce the number of coal-fired power plants that we increase by every year, if we do these things, then all will be well in our relationship. That is an enormous sacrifice for American security to the altar of the Green New Deal.
And we talked about this. They're barely even pretending. If you looked at really what China had to say, they were like, "Oh yeah, maybe we'll get to it." It wasn't even like a hard yes, we're together. It was more like John Kerry, we're going to self-regulate ourselves and let's hope they do the same. It was.
No goodness, yeah. This will prove to be a charade. They'll make no firm commitment, and whatever ephemeral promise that they make, they will violate, just as they've violated all the others. It's a shame that they appear to have fallen for this Chinese Communist Party parlor game trick and are going to sacrifice American security to get there.
Now, Secretary Pompeo, you brought up that Secretary Blinken has had some tough statements recently regarding China and genocide and urging other nations to join together to kind of help put a stop to this and not to encourage or enable this in some ways. But it almost seems to put him at odds with what the climate czar Kerry's agenda is on this China deal. We know that John Kerry subverted the foreign policy of the Trump administration with the Iran-backed dealings, but is he now actually subverting the foreign policy of the Biden administration?
It's always a concern when you have someone like Secretary Kerry who is going to go around and make climate change the signature issue for the administration when Secretary Blinken's got a much broader, much deeper, much more difficult task in front of him. I hope it's not the case. I hope the administration is speaking with a singular voice. Secretary Blinken has done good work. His language on China has been good. His language on genocide has been good. Now they need to take actions that reflect what Secretary Blinken has said. And I hope that we don't have a former secretary out giving a different message than the current Secretary of State. That would send missed signals that would confuse the world, and it would put America at risk.
I think, Will, that's right. I think a lot of people don't even understand necessarily these positions. When you hear the climate czar, it doesn't necessarily click of who this person is. And I think because we are so used to John Kerry and other roles, as you said, Mike, that it's an odd situation to put them in, because it does feel like there's two different administrations talking. And you have Blinken, who, like we said, we've had many moments now that we've agreed with him on. And we've had, some pretty strong rhetoric coming from him. But then when you have on the opposite side, I mean, how do you deal with that within an administration that if you're China, who are you listening to?
It's complicated. Don't forget there'll be other voices as well. The responsibility of the president is to make sure that there's a single policy, a single set of priorities. Ours were pretty clear.
Yeah.
America first. Secretary of State's running that foreign policy for me. We're going to place America's security at the top of the list. Everything else will be subservient to that. We did that well, and it meant we could protect religious freedom around the world, human rights around the world. We could get hostages back from around the world. We could do each of those things while preserving American security. I hope they'll find a voice, a single voice, and then a single set of policies that they deliver against. If they do, America will be far better off for it.
Thanks. We only have a couple minutes here, but I do want to kind of address this question quickly and take it as you will. I think the American people hear this and they go, well, we obviously know we deal with China a lot. Like I said, looking at the equipment that's around us, there's no way this show is probably on the air without things manufactured in China. So how does the United States actually come to these agreements when we have to work with them in some sense, but on the other side, we have extreme like I said, genocide happening and other horrible human rights violations?
So it's very complex. We have spent 40 years engaging with China, drawing closer to them economically. We now have deep interconnections. We need to begin to move past that and unwind that. We can no longer adopt a policy that says for a ration of porridge, we will trade American security. So we need to make sure that these companies all understand they are American companies. They benefit from being American companies. When it comes to American national security, we need every company to understand their supply chain, know what the risk is to the United States, and begin to unwind in a way that protects America's interest. It will not happen overnight. It won't happen in a week, but it's got to happen.
Thank you so much, Secretary Pompeo. It was great to have you on.